Welcome, storyteller. You're about to embark on a journey where history whispers, adventure roars, and English comes alive. This is Woo English, where every tale is a treasure chest of words waiting to be unlocked. Today, you'll hear the unbelievable true story of how Napoleon's mighty army was brought to its knees, not by swords or storms, but by something smaller than a grain of sand. You'll feel the freezing Russian winter, hear the coughs of dying soldiers, and discover how the tiniest creatures changed history forever. And here's the magic. While the story pulls you in, your English grows stronger. Every word, every pause, every emotion is fuel for your language skills. So lean in, listen closely, and let the past ignite your future fluency. Ready? Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Rise of an Emperor. Napoleon Bonaparte. A name that echoed across Europe. A name that made kings tremble and soldiers follow without question. He was not born a ruler. No. He was born on a small, rocky island, Corsica, far from the grand palaces of Paris. But even as a boy, he dreamed of greatness. Destiny, he would whisper to himself, staring at the stars. Destiny has plans for me. And destiny was listening. By the year 1812, Napoleon was no longer just a man. He was an emperor, a conqueror. His empire stretched from the sunny coasts of Spain to the frozen forests of Poland. Europe is mine, he declared. And for a time, it was. His soldiers adored him. They called him Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal, not because he was weak, no, because he stood beside them, fought with them, led them to victory again and again and again. For France, they shouted as their enemies fell before them. For glory. But ambition is a hungry beast. Napoleon had taken Austria, humbled Prussia, forced Russia to kneel once, but it was not enough. The world must remember my name, he whispered in the dark. And so, in the summer of 1812, he made a decision that would change everything. We march east, he told his generals. We march to Russia. 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. Poles, Italians, Germans, French, all united under Napoleon's Golden Eagle. They called it La Grande Armée, the Grand Army. The soldiers laughed as they packed their bags. Russia? Ha! They will run like rabbits. But one old veteran, a man who had fought in the snow before, did not laugh. He stared at the horizon and shivered. Winter is coming, he muttered. And winter does not forgive. Little did they know. The real enemy was not waiting in Russia. It was already with them, hiding in their clothes, in their hair, in the seams of their uniforms, tiny, silent, deadly. Chapter 2. The Grand Invasion. June, 1812. A date that would echo through history. The sun burned high in the sky as Napoleon's army stirred to life. 600,000 men. The largest fighting force Europe had ever seen. Soldiers from every corner of his empire, French, Polish, Italian, German, all standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the same fluttering banners. "En avant!" came the cry. "Forward!" And forward they marched, eastward, toward Russia. The men laughed as they walked. "We'll be in Moscow before the leaves fall," boasted a young private, adjusting his pack. "The Russians won't dare fight us," another grinned, polishing his musket. "They'll take one look at this army and surrender." Even the generals were confident. "Victory will be swift," Napoleon declared, his voice ringing with certainty. But in the shadows, not everyone was so sure. An old sergeant, his face scarred from a dozen battles, stared at the horizon. "I don't like it," he muttered. "No enemy in sight, no battles to fight, just miles and miles of nothing." He was right. Russia wasn't going to fight them. Russia was going to disappear. Day after day, the Grande Armée marched deeper into the Russian countryside. But where were the Russians? Gone. Villages stood empty. Barns were stripped bare. Wells poisoned. "Not even a chicken left," a corporal whispered, his stomach growling. The land itself seemed to turn against them. Dust choked their throats by day, and at night the temperature plunged, leaving men shivering in their tents. And then the first signs of trouble. "I can't sleep," a young soldier groaned, twisting in his bedroll. "Something's biting me." Lice, tiny, relentless, hidden in the seams of uniforms, in the folds of blankets, crawling, biting, feeding. They were everywhere. Napoleon pressed onward, his eyes fixed on the distant prize. Moscow, the heart of Russia. "Take the city," he told his generals, "and the war is won." But behind him, his army was already weakening. Men fell ill, burning with fever, their skin erupting in angry rashes. Typhus. The doctors whispered the word like a curse. "Keep moving," the officers shouted. And so they did, stumbling forward, toward a fate none of them could imagine. Moscow was waiting. Chapter 3. The Russian Trap. Retreat? Napoleon's generals couldn't believe their eyes. The Russian army was running, not standing to fight, not defending their homeland, just disappearing into the endless horizon. "This isn't right," muttered Marshal Ney, his hand tightening on his sword. "No army retreats like this unless it wasn't a retreat at all. Unless it was a trap." Then the smoke began to rise. First one village, then another, then hundreds. The Russians were burning everything: crops, barns, homes. "They're leaving us nothing. No food, no shelter, only ashes." The French soldiers stared at the blackened ruins, their stomachs growling. The land itself had become their enemy. And then they saw it. Moscow. The golden city. The ultimate prize. September 14th, 1812. Napoleon rode into Moscow at the head of his army, expecting surrender, expecting glory. Instead, the city was empty. Not a soul in the streets, not a scrap of food in the markets, just silence. And then, fire. No one knew who started it. The Russians? Criminals? The wind itself? It didn't matter. Within hours, Moscow was an inferno. Flames devoured palaces, churches, hope itself. Napoleon stood in the Kremlin, watching his dreams burn. This is impossible, he whispered. For the first time in his life, the Emperor of Victory had no idea what to do. And then winter came. Not just winter, general winter, the coldest in living memory. Men who had laughed at the Russian summer now clutched their thin coats, their breath freezing in their lungs. "We have to get out of here," the whispers began, "before it's too late." But it was already too late. The real killer wasn't the cold. It was already inside them. Chapter 4. The Silent Enemy. The cold was bad enough. The hunger, worse. But there was something else moving through Napoleon's army. Something smaller. Private Jean Moreau couldn't sleep. Not because of the freezing Russian night. Not because his stomach growled with emptiness. But because of the itching. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, holding up his uniform jacket to the weak firelight. The seams moved. Tiny, pale creatures crawled through the stitching. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Lice. Dr. Lary, Napoleon's chief surgeon, knew something was wrong. More and more men were reporting to the medical tents, not with battle wounds, but with feverish eyes and shaking hands. "Describe your symptoms," Larry demanded, pressing a hand to a private's burning forehead. "It started with headaches." The man shuddered. Then the fever, the chills, and this. He pulled open his shirt, revealing a rash of angry red spots crawling across his skin like some monstrous constellation. Typhus. Larry wrote frantically in his medical log, "The men call it camp fever. It begins with headaches and joint pain. Then comes the high fever, so hot their teeth chatter. The rash appears on the 5th day, and by the 7th, he didn't need to write the rest. They all knew what happened by the 7th day. "This is nonsense!" shouted General Davout, slamming his fist on a map table. "We lose more men to sickness than to Russian bullets." The officers looked at each other. No one wanted to say the truth aloud. Their army was being destroyed. Not by the enemy, but by creatures smaller than a grain of rice. Back in the ranks, Jean Moreau scratched at his arms. Now covered in the telltale rash, his vision swam with fever. "Maman!" he whispered to the frozen air. Around him, dozens of men just like him shivered under thin blankets. Some would never wake up. The cruelest joke of all? The lice. loved the conditions. The unwashed uniforms? Perfect. The crowded tents? Ideal. The soldiers' falling body heat as they grew weaker? Just right. With every passing hour, the silent enemy grew stronger. Chapter 5. The Horror of Typhus. It began with a shiver, just a slight tremble in the hands, a cold sweat on the brow. Probably just tired, the soldiers would mutter, rubbing their arms. But it was never just tired. Private Lefebvre was the first in his company to fall. One moment, marching in line. The next, Mon Dieu! Lefebvre's down! His face burned crimson with fever. His uniform was soaked through with sweat, despite the freezing air. When they opened his shirt, purple-black spots, like bruises, but moving, crawling across his skin like some nightmarish vine. "It's the plague!" someone screamed. Dr. Larry pressed a trembling hand to yet another soldier's forehead. "The fever. It's too high," he murmured. "This man should be boiling. But look." When he pulled away his medical instrument, patches of the soldier's skin came with it. The doctor's journal grew more desperate with each entry. Day 1, headache, muscle pain. Day 3, fever reaches infernal levels. Men report seeing dead comrades walking. Day 5, the rash appears. Day 7, those still alive wish they weren't. "Maman, is that you?" The water. Why is the water on fire? Make them stop screaming. Make them stop. The men called it La Folie de Typhus, the typhus madness, and it spread, faster than the lice themselves. "You must do something," General Ney roared, gesturing at the rows of shivering, moaning men. "There is nothing to be done, Doctor," Larry admitted. "No medicine, no cure, only endings." And so, the Grande Armée began to devour itself. Chapter 6. An Army of Ghosts. October 1812. The Grande Armée was no longer grande. What had been 600,000 strong now numbered fewer than 100,000. And with each passing hour, that number grew smaller. They called it the Road of Bones. Not because men died there, but because the dead were left there. No time for burials, no strength for pyres, just corpses in the ditches. Some still sat upright, frozen in their final moments. Others were just pieces, torn apart by wolves or desperate comrades. "Captain, I can't feel my feet." The officer didn't need to look. They all knew what black toes meant. Frostbite. Men cut off their own fingers with bayonets, gnawed at frozen bread until their teeth shattered, and still. Onward. Moscow is just... But there was no Moscow anymore. Only ghosts and ice. Dr. Lari stared at his hands. They weren't his hands anymore. Not the steady surgeon's hands that had saved thousands. These were butcher's hands, blackened with frostbite, shaking with exhaustion. He couldn't remember. When he'd last slept, when he'd last washed, the lice didn't care. The emperor stared at the latest reports. 50,000 men, gone. Not in battle. Not to Russian guns. To nothing. To cold. To hunger. To things too small to see. For the first time in his life, Napoleon Bonaparte was afraid. This isn't an army anymore. It was a funeral procession, and winter had only just begun. Chapter 7. The Retreat Begins. October 19th, 1812. The word passed through the ranks like a death sentence. Retreat. For the first time in his legendary career, Napoleon Bonaparte was giving up. "Form ranks," officers shouted, their voices hoarse with cold. But there were no ranks anymore. Just shadows of men, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, many still burning with typhus fever. "Leave the cannons," came the order. Even the emperor's famous guard now looked like scarecrows in uniform. The first horror came at the Berezina River, the frozen river they'd crossed so easily weeks before, now groaned under their weight. "Don't stop," screamed a colonel. "Keep moving or—" Men disappeared beneath the black water in seconds, their heavy packs dragging them down like stones. "Did you hear that?" a young soldier whispered. Yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness. Dozens of them. Wolves. By morning, the camp's edges were littered with parts. And the lice? They didn't care about wolves. They had living men to feed on. "How many today?" Napoleon asked quietly. 5,000. At least, murmured an aide. Most to the cold, some to the Cossacks, a few dots. He didn't finish. They all knew about the ones who chose their end. Musket barrels in mouths, boots left neatly by riverbanks, his own toes, black and dead, had just fallen off in his boot. All around him, the retreat continued. A slow, shuffling nightmare. Men ripped their own frozen ears off by accident, chewed leather straps for food, stole boots from corpses, only to find the feet inside came with them. And through it all, the lice kept biting. This wasn't a retreat. It was a funeral march. 600,000 had marched into Russia. How many would make it out? Chapter 8. The Crossing of Hell. November 26th, 1812. The word spread through what remained of the Grande Armée like a death rattle. Berezina. The last barrier between them and home. God have mercy, for the river will not. The river should have been frozen solid. It wasn't. Beneath a thin crust of ice, black, churning water waited. Build bridges! Engineers shouted. But there were no tools, no materials, just the bones of abandoned villages. And the Russians? Closing in for 3 endless days. Men worked waist deep in freezing water, their hands turning to blocks of ice. Others clutched their muskets, waiting for the attack they knew would come. The weak slipped from makeshift bridges, swallowed whole by the hungry current. "Don't look down," a corporal screamed, just before the ice beneath him exploded from cannon fire. December 1st. The bridges are death traps. Horses panic and crush men. Women and children are trampled. The screams... Oh God, the screams never stop. We are not soldiers anymore. We are... How many crossed? The emperor asked. Perhaps 20,000. Out of 600,000. What remained of the French rearguard wasn't human anymore. Men with blackened limbs crawled on all fours. Mothers clutched frozen babies to their chests. A single half-mad drummer boy, still beating the retreat. The crossing was over. The dying was just beginning. Chapter 9. The Fall of an Empire. December 5th, 1812. A lone carriage raced west through the snow. Inside sat a ghost. Napoleon Bonaparte was going home. But the man who had conquered Europe was already gone. When the emperor arrived at the Tuileries Palace, no cheers greeted him, no triumphant fanfares, just silence and the whispers. They say only 1 in 30 survived. They say he abandoned his own men. They say he can be beaten. "Sire," muttered Talleyrand, his voice slick as oil, "the Austrians are mobilizing. The Prussians are arming. Even your own marshals." He didn't need to finish. The news had spread faster than typhus. Napoleon was vulnerable. In his private chambers, Napoleon stared at the casualty reports. 580,000 men. Gone. Not to glorious battle. Not to honorable defeat, but to lice, to snow, to nothing. Across Europe, the waltzes had changed tune. In Vienna, "God Save the Emperor Francis." In Berlin, "Death to the French." In London, "Victory at last." The world was realigning, and France was no longer at its center. Napoleon stood over his sleeping son, the King of Rome. "I wanted to give you the world," he whispered. Now, he'd be lucky to give him France. And so it began. The unraveling. Leipzig, Elba, Waterloo, all because of an itch, a scratch, an empire lost. Chapter 10. The Science of the Unseen. Paris, 1909. Nearly a century after the Russian snows swallowed Napoleon's army, the truth finally emerged. Mon Dieu. Under the glass slide, a louse feasted on human blood. And in its gut, the answer to history's greatest military disaster. Professor Charles Nicoll stood before skeptical colleagues. Typhus does not spread through bad air as we thought, he declared. It travels like this. The assembled doctors leaned forward, then recoiled in horror. Lice. Hundreds of them. The itching never stops, like the devil himself lives in our seams. Now they understood. Every scratched entry, every feverish complaint, every description of rashes like burning constellations had been warnings they couldn't read. "Papa, what are those tiny black dots?" The father squints, then pales. Not dirt, not aging fabric, eggs, lice eggs, laid by the last hungry creatures to march with the Grande Armée. You're saying Napoleon, the greatest military mind in history, was defeated by insects. Not just insects, messieurs, the smallest soldiers in the Russian army. The room fell silent. All those years. All those history books about tactics and supply lines and winter missed the real story. The story crawling through the seams of uniforms, hiding in the folds of blankets, biting in the dark. New research confirms it. Of Napoleon's 600,000 men, 400,000 may have fallen to typhus alone. More than to all Russian cannons. More than to the freezing cold. More than to hunger and despair. Combined. So remember, the next time you feel small, insignificant, powerless, remember the louse, who proved size means nothing.